Thank you all. This conference has been the best preparation for my thesis defense next week. And after this, I'm ready for anything. I would like to begin my talk by thanking everyone. And I know that many of you, even though you don't know me by person, have been praying first for the Christ at the Checkpoint conference. But I also know that many of you have been praying for me personally, as I have been involved in an accident last November and was hit by a car and was in a serious situation, and thank God for his healing. And I would like to thank those of you who prayed for me, and I really, really appreciate you, and I wish I could thank you one by one by name. And it was really a challenging period because, preparing for the conference and then having to sit for 2 months at home, and this caused a lot of pressure. And my wife knows how many nights I came late to bed and I said, I'm just tired of this Christ at the Checkpoint. I don't want to do it again. But I can't wait for the next one now. The title of my talk comes from the question of the teacher of the law in Luke chapter 10. The question that prompts Jesus to tell his famous parable of the Good Samaritan. But in order for us to fully understand the real meaning or motivation behind asking the question, who is my neighbor, we must examine the encounter between Jesus and the lawyer from the beginning. So a lawyer comes to Jesus and asks, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? This is by no means an innocent question by which the lawyer wanted to know how to get saved or how to go to heaven. For this is a teacher of the law, after all. And Luke tells us specifically that he was testing Jesus. You see, in the time of Jesus, this was a theologically and to a certain degree a politically loaded question. The question, as commentators tell us, is about the age to come or the coming reign of God. How can one be part of this age to come? You see, it was a debated question for many, and there were many answers in Jesus' days, and depending on how you answer it determines which sects you belong to. So the Pharisees answered this question different than the Sadducees, different than the Zealots. So how you answered this theological question determined whether you were orthodox or a heretic. It determined whether you were one of us or one of them. In other words, maybe the question really is, which is the right sect? See, this discussion then led to the conclusion that loving God and loving neighbor were the real requirements to entering the kingdom of God. And this is where things began to become very, very interesting. The question of the lawyer, which we are looking at tonight, who is my neighbor? Let us think for a moment about the lawyer's question. What is he really saying? I believe that what the lawyer is actually saying by asking the question, who is with us and who is against us? By this question, I believe that the man was actually drawing a circle around him. Circle. And the question was, who is inside so that I love? And who is outside so I'm not obligated to love? The question reflects a typical sectarian mindset. And this mindset, unfortunately, is very, very prevalent in the Middle East today. It's a mindset that divides the world into them versus us. And the Middle East today, probably more than ever, typifies this mindset. We have tragically mastered this art. We first draw lines, then we separate and reject, then we stereotype and demonize, and finally, we kill. And by the way, sometimes we kill by words. It doesn't have to be physical violence. Religious and sectarian violence is at a rise in this part of the world. We are all troubled and disgusted by the barbaric massacres we see in Syria today. Muslims kill Christians simply because they are Christians. They are outside the circle. They're not one of us. Muslims even kill Muslims if they do not belong to the same sect. We see the violence of Sunni versus Shiite. Our heart and prayers, of course, goes for all the victims of violence in Syria, especially our Christians brothers and sisters. And of course, I can talk about the violence in Iraq and in Lebanon and to the persecution of Christians in Egypt, and we were all moved by the testimony of the Coptic Church today. But here at home, and I begin by pointing the finger at my own people. Many Palestinians today dream of a land without the Jews. Some even continue to call for the Jews to be driven out to the sea, and some continue to encourage suicide attacks. Many call Jews by names that I am ashamed to utter, and sometimes it comes from religious people, people I call preachers of hate. Here at home, nothing speaks more loudly and starkly about the separation and division mentality than the ugly concrete wall just outside of this hotel. A wall that says, you stay here and we are here. And by the way, the wall is only a reflection of a deeper and harsher reality. In Palestine and in Israel today, we simply do not like each other. We do not consider those who are different than us as our neighbors. And by the way, I'm not convinced that the wall is fully motivated by security. We are troubled by the route of the wall. If it was for security, it will be built between Palestinian and Israeli land, not between Palestinian and Palestinian land. And that is why we are troubled by the wall as Palestinians. I will now address a very controversial issue. Israel continues to insist today that we Palestinians accept Israel as a Jewish state, as a precondition to any peace agreement. I must admit I have a serious issue with this, and I speak here as a Christian, because I am against any religious state to begin with. In addition, this is such an exclusive way of defining a state, especially when you remember that there are at least 1.5 million non-Jews who live in this land, and who, by the way, have been living in this land for hundreds, if not thousands of years, way before the modern state of Israel was created. To insist on a Jewish state is, in essence, to deny and remove 2,000 years of world history in this land. And please understand what I'm saying. I am not denying any Jewish attachment to this land, or Israel's right to exist, or Israel as a place where Jews can live safely. I am simply against having a monopoly over this land and using any exclusive language. I do not care how you try to justify this. You say Jewish and democratic, but for me, the moment you insist on defining the state of Israel as a Jewish state, you begin drawing these big circles where Jews are in and others are out. And by the way, I am also against the notion that the Palestinian Authority, though is not an Islamic state, regards Islam as the official religion in Palestine, because this also qualifies me as a second-class citizen. We should not be characterized as a religious minority that needs protection. We are part of the majority as Palestinians, people who have been living in this land for many, many years. We are the people of the land as well. And you see, we have for years fought against this unjust Islamic Dhimma law that treated Christians and Jews as second-class citizens, as different category, a religious minority. And I am afraid that this is happening now in the Middle East. We are witnessing the rise of religious state mentality in the Middle East, and Joseph Cummings spoke brilliantly about this. But here at home, a law was passed recently in the Israeli Knesset that identifies Christians as a minority group separate from the Arabs, most of whom are Muslims. And this law gives Christians some special privileges. Again, I am very troubled by this. This law clearly discriminates. It's a law that discriminates between Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims. And thankfully, the vast majority of Christian leaders in Israel are objecting this discriminatory law. You see, the problem is in defining or categorizing people and putting them against other people. And Christians, I believe, must reject any privilege because we must all be equal. We're not looking for any privilege. But are we as Christians innocent of this mentality of separation? Of course, though we do not like to admit it, we are as guilty. We might not be violent, but inside of us, we are capable of being some of the most prejudiced or bigotry people, especially against people of other faiths. We also think in terms of us versus them. Some Christians in Palestine and the Middle East dream of a world without Muslims. The same could be said about many Christians around the world, in Europe and in USA, who rather than seeing the Muslim immigration as an opportunity to a loving witness, see it only as a threat. Islamophobia is alive today. Now, how do I know this? Because I'm a Palestinian. And for many, being a Palestinian equals being a Muslim, equals being a terrorist. Not one of us, one of them. And so as I ask, is the Palestinian a neighbor? You see, for many, Palestinian and a Christian is an oxymoron. And I can give example upon example of times when we were invited to speak in Christian conferences only to see strong opposition in our presence, to our presence, simply because we are Palestinians. And sometimes we were disinvited. In the language of Luke 10, we are not neighbors, so there is no need to hear us. We are outside of the circles. And by the way, you are now outside of the circles for coming to meet with us. Sorry, we did not worry about this, but you will probably be excluded from many circles. You have to face it. And I'll be more honest. I must admit that it hurts and breaks my heart that in many evangelical circles, and please forgive me for saying this, I am not a neighbor and I'm not allowed to speak unless my testimony is qualified or balanced with the other perspective. Many times we go to conferences only to realize the only condition for accepting us is if a Messianic brother or sister speaks. I'm not against this, but you see, the idea is I am not qualified as a neighbor unless my message is balanced. And I don't like that. So, in many circles, meeting a Palestinian or a Muslim is a sin. And makes me wonder, did Jesus, by the way, meet with sinners? Did he love them? Did he take pictures with them? You may know, I'm sure, that there is a campaign against us, Palestinian Christians. A campaign to silence us. Why? I believe it is because we challenge the comfortable paradigm of many Christians who prefer to look at this conflict as a religious one. A conflict between the Judeo-Christian tradition, good, us, versus Islam, bad, them. So we Palestinian Christians disturb this picture and mess up their worldview. And that is, many are not comfortable. That is why many are not comfortable to listen to our testimony. But I must ask here, is the Christian only my neighbor? See, I see that in many Christians could not care less about the suffering of the Palestinians over the years. But when one Palestinian Christian is murdered by radical Muslims, they are outraged. It is as if the lives of Muslim Palestinians are less valuable in the sight of God. And don't get me wrong, we should be outraged about the murder of the Palestinian Christian in Gaza, Brother Rami. But what about the many, many other Muslim Palestinians who have been murdered in this conflict? Do we care? Today, many Christians around the world are raging, and rightly so, about the barbaric massacres against Christians in Syria, but are not as much outraged about the siege around the Yarmouk refugee camp. In other words, only Christians are neighbors. We care only for the suffering of Christians. Makes me wonder, what if Bethlehem was on the other side of the wall? Would this conference take place? Would Christians care to come to see the suffering of Palestinians if there were no Christians here? Would evangelicals come to this conference if there were no evangelicals in Bethlehem? Do you consider your other, Orthodox and Catholic Christians as your neighbor as well, as your brothers and sisters? You see, we keep drawing these circles. Only evangelicals are in, only Christians are in. We do it all the time. Brothers and sisters, we have no credibility when we only protest the persecution of Christians while ignoring the injustice against people of other faiths. And so Jesus answers. We draw the lines defining who the neighbor is. We ask this question all the time. And this is why I love Jesus' answer. And we need to be careful not to miss some details in the story. Very, very crucial elements in Jesus' answer. Jesus says that the man who was attacked was left naked and unconscious. And here is the dilemma now. The two religious people who passed by him, and by the way, the two religious people, why did they not stop? This question was asked to a Sunday school boy, and the boy answered, well, because he had no money left. But I say that the two religious people, I always say they did not stop because they were probably on their way to a Christian conference. They were doing something religious. But let's get to the point. The man was naked and unconscious. And here's the problem. They were not able to determine his identity. Why? Because in that state, he could not speak. So they could not determine from his accent where he is from, or whether he is a Jew or a Gentile or a Samaritan. And from his dress, they could not tell whether he's a soldier, a Jew, or a Gentile. And so here is the dilemma. Who is he? Is he a Roman soldier? Is he a Samaritan? Is he a Jew? Should I help him or should I not? Is he one of us to help him or is he one of them? See, Jesus' answer is clear. He is a human being. Remember the question. Where do I draw the lines? Who is my neighbor? What does Jesus do? He simply removes the lines. And this is what Jesus does. He comes and removes the lines. There is no circle, Jesus says. There is no us and them when defining the neighbor. Everyone is a neighbor, and we are called, and I repeat, we are called by God to love them as ourselves. It is not a matter of choice. But this is, by the way, not the only way in the parable in which Jesus reveals the prejudice in the lawyer who asked the question, who is my neighbor? There is something else powerful here. Who helps the wounded person? Who helps him? A Samaritan. See, 2,000 years apart from this original context, really the point is softened, because 2,000 years ago, this would have been like a shock. Samaritans were despised and hated. They were not considered pure. A Jew could not even walk in their cities. In John 8:48, we read that they were regarded as demon-possessed by the Jews. In Luke 9:54, the disciples of Jesus suggest to Jesus, Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? See, the disciples too were dreaming of a world without Samaritans. And so when Jesus mentions Samaritans, it is a shock. It is a big, big shock. Colin Chapman, my dear, dear friend and mentor, was once speaking to Palestinian pastors. And I will always remember what he said. He said, after years of living in the Middle East and seeing how many Arab pastors looked at Muslims, he suggested that every time we read the word Samaritan in the Bible, that we should replace it with the word Muslim. And a Muslim man stopped and helped him. If Jesus tells this story here in Bethlehem again, he would probably say, and a Muslim helped him. What a powerful testimony we heard yesterday from Dr. Azzuddin. Amen. He will probably say a rabbi helped him. If Jesus tells the story in a Jewish context, in a Messianic context, he would probably say, and a Muslim, a Palestinian. Where is Bob? I want Bob to try this. Go to a church in Texas and say, read the story and say, and an Iranian or a Palestinian stopped by and helped him. I'll be curious to see the reaction of the congregation. What would happen? You see, here's the thing. It is really ironic and sad that we say that we are saved by grace, but carry ourselves in a way that says otherwise. We act as if we earned our salvation. We act as if we are better than them. And so what happens when we do not treat others as neighbors? We become religious and we become apathetic. We become indifferent. The person who asked the question, who is my neighbor, and the two men in the story who passed by the victim were all religious people. See, for me, the story is in essence a lament. A lament by Jesus about us religious people. People who are concerned about the right theology and the right interpretation, only to become indifferent to the suffering of those around us. I see Jesus lamenting in this story. And so before we talk about how we can become agents of peace, I believe we must look inward to our communities, to our doctrines, to our theology, to our practice, to our history, and we must lament. The challenge for us as evangelicals is to love others and treat them like neighbors, without losing our Christian distinctives and without compromising our commitment to evangelism or to the uniqueness of Christ. And I know this is a big challenge, but I am also convinced that unless we begin to break these barriers between us and people who are different than us, unless Christians break the barriers with people of other faith, and we begin to see them as neighbors and defend them and love them and rescue them and allow them to defend us and to do the same for us, until we do so, we will not be able to witness effectively to them. And I'll be more direct. In many evangelical circles, I fear that we have created this monster called Islam and Muslims. And by doing so, we have effectively paralyzed a whole generation from approaching Muslims out of fear and hatred. All, by the way, while still talking about evangelisms to Muslims. So who is my neighbor? This is the question in front of us. And I want to ask this question in relation to the theology of the land. And I'll summarize my thesis in the next 2 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. Who is my neighbor is tied with the question, where is my neighbor? And I would like to propose here what I call a shared land theology. A shared land theology that speaks against the dominant views in our world. A shared land theology is a theology where we are all neighbors. You see, if we look at the political situations or solutions that are being discussed nowadays, we will see that they do not speak about sharing the land, but only about dividing it. They revolve around the question of what is ours and what is theirs. We're going back to the same circle. We are here, you are there. But we must ask, what does the kingdom of God look like in the land today? The failure of humanity to live in peace and harmony here, in the land of promise, is deeply sad. The challenge raised in front of the church today is to preach and practice a theology of shared land. A theology of a shared land means that we are all the dwellers of the land, share the land and its resources equally, and have the same rights, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. Today in Palestine, Today in the West Bank, there are two laws on the ground, one for the Palestinians and one for the Jewish settlers. When it comes to issues like travel restrictions, water allocations, family reunification, there are two laws on the ground. And by the way, these things are not related to security. A shared land theology emphasizes that there are no second-class citizens in the land. No one is marginalized in God's vision of the land. A shared land is not simply an option, I would argue. It is the only option forward. This is the biblical vision, and it must be the prophetic vision of the church in Palestine and in Israel. And the reality of the ground is that of walls. Yet what is needed is a vision of bridges. Palestinians and Israelis must think collectively in terms of a common future in which they cooperate, not a divided future in which they separate. But let us remember that for this to happen, the occupation must end. As long as there is an occupier and an occupied, we cannot talk about any common future. Unless we are equal, we cannot talk about sharing the land. And so a shared land is a land where we are all neighbors and we are all equal. And for this to happen, the occupation must end. And I conclude. Remember that the discussion with Jesus and the lawyer, it concludes by this in Luke 10:37. Jesus says, do likewise. Do likewise. Remember the question in the beginning? It was about the right theology. Jesus' answer, it is not about the right theology. The right theology is the right practice. It is about doing it. We Christians, and dare I say, we evangelicals, can really be very orthodox in our theology, yet heretics in our practice. In the spirit of 1 Corinthians 13, let us remember that without love, we are nothing. And Jesus said, they shall know that we are his disciples, not by our theology, thank God, not by our doctrine, but by our love. And I simply say, my prayer that may we all be people who are marked and distinguished by our love to each other and to our neighbors. Thank you.
Wow.